Well, time to explain why the fuck I just did all this. So, we have been struggling to balance these different variants against each other. And we've actually achieved the balance of things like Shang-Chi like things versus chess before. But a lot of the good ideas that come up might work for one matchup, but will get in the way of another. This is especially true because we have some very weird armies in our game, such as the Shogi army, which has drops, the Shang-Chi army, which has open files, is very weak to diagonals, and has pretty flexible cannons to harass compressed positions, and a weak king, and all kinds of shit. We have Frost Beast, which has ghost stone mechanics and rules. So, I just spent the last 12 hours or so brainstorming, really contemplating and understanding the changes that needed to happen today. So I'm going to summarize all of it here in case you don't want to read through all of the Discord channels of the absolute mess I just made. Because basically I just walked into a house, decided I didn't like the layout, and started knocking walls down, in a sense. First of all, let's start navigating. So what this says is I've added ramparts, which is an extra rank at the back of every territory. So at the back of your army, say the chess army, there's this extra row with special rules. And this is for everybody. Now, reinforcements are now balanced to the matchup rather than being a blanket thing. So what we were trying to do before was balance everything against medieval and let the balance fall where it may with the other armies and just let it exist. And unlike something like a fighting game where letting a meta develop is fine, this game has to be properly balanced because it is turn-based, it is deterministic, and it is brutal. So because it is turn-based, deterministic, and brutal, having matchup differences just means that you're offering options that players won't be able to use. And even more than that, some of these armies have cultural significance to players and personalities and personal identities because we're including traditional games like Shang-Chi, Shang-Chi, Zhanggi, and Shogi. Shang-Chi, Zhanggi, Shogi. I'm sorry, I had to make sure I said that right. So, that being said, since it isn't working to do that, especially when those problem children face each other, then we have to do this. Another thing to note is there are 3 armies that we included that we call heavy armies. So, of our core 10 battalions, we have 1 special case, 4 heavy armies, and I'm going to include chess as a heavy army here, 3 traditional armies, and 2 original armies for 10 total. So those 4 heavy armies are either chess itself or they were engine balanced by another developer to be even with the chess army. And we've included 3 of those, which is Spartan, Golden Horde, and Holy Empire. The 3 traditional armies are the armies that we have included because of their historical significance. And that would be the Shang-Chi army, the Zhanggi army, and the Shogi army. The two original armies are ones by our creation, which are basically built around a certain mechanic or mechanics and designed to try to bring out a new type of strategy that's never been seen before in these games and fight the other ones. And those are Twin Suns and Frost Beasts. But the heavy armies we don't have that much issue with. It would be quite easy to make Titans Battalion work with just the heavy armies. And in fact, we could do that today. But we actually had, even in those matches, an issue with a long-running mechanic called the battlefield movement, where we allowed pawns to move sideways as long as they were on that central battlefield. And to iterate this, I'm actually going to bring up a board and show you. This is very free flow, but you know, I'm a chess variant dev who's just fucking obsessed. So feel free to listen to me talk if you want to. I'm very sleep deprived as well. Oh yeah, you guys can't see what that fucking noise is. There we go. So even in, say, the chess mirror, this battlefield movement exists so that if we utilize the battlefield placement to have an off-kilter setup, a skewed setup, there will be cases where pawns get stuck. They don't have a full rank to get to. So our solution was in this area that I've marked in blue called the battlefield that the player's attached to at the start of the game. The pawns are just allowed to move sideways. The problem is, with some very basic opening ideas, right? If I just, you know, play out the Spanish a bit, and we get to this point, and black decides to go into the Berlin, and this trade happens, it doesn't matter that this pawn is doubled. And your normal ideas that matter about doubling this pawn one way or the other, right, get in the way. And even if you play this out to an endgame, you can eventually move this up protected, move this up protected, move this over, and you fixed your pawn structure. It just takes time. And that detracted from the gameplay. But at the same time, that battlefield movement allowed for new ideas to exist that never had before. So for example, here are 2 extra gambits that didn't exist before in this position. You could do this, of course. You could do this, of course. But now you can also sidestep this, and if they choose to take it, you can move the knight here. And that's a whole new set of lines. It's not a good move, mind you, but there's ideas where it does work. So another example would be if we... Don't do that. Don't do that. Well, it's not too bad. If we do something like this, later on, you can move this pawn here as an additional pawn break if for some reason you don't want to or can't move this one. So it creates new opening ideas. But because it sacrifices too much of pawn structure, we can't have it in full. So we've now implemented a charge system based on matchup to see just exactly how many you actually need. This gives us another fine-tooth idea for balance that exists. So in this case, in the chess mirror, because the largest discrepancy is always 2 squares on 10 wide battlefields, and that's 1, 2, 3 battlefield charges that you have, which I will mark here. And both sides have this. And these battlefield charges, you spend them in order to actually do that sidestep. So if you want to do something weird over here for some sort of tactic, you're essentially trapping one of your pawns behind this wall. And you can instead choose to use them exactly for their intended purpose and allow the pawns to advance all the way. So that means we're allowing pieces to get stuck, but we're leaving it up to the player, and we're always giving them a way out. And this also, like I said, gives us a fine-tooth balance dial, because we can grant matchups additional battlefield charges in order to give them more options and allow them potentially to thrive more with just a tiny little bit more. And I don't know how much. I think we want to stay in the range of no more than like either 3 or 5 above base, like bare minimum on battlefield charges. And we should use that as like a little comb, and maybe later we could figure out how many of these is equal to a pawn and then have that as a baseline. But it helps. And for example, this guy actually only, in this matchup, has 1 battlefield charge. And that's just for this guy. Meanwhile, he still would have that battlefield charge if he placed like this, which means that you don't always need it. It's just that you'll have it. And yeah, and then the shogi army has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 against the chess army. So I'll put the other 2 up here real quick. And then, since the ramparts matter, but they don't have to matter, right? So I'm not going to even bother putting it up here, because the ramparts can only be entered by your deployment zone pieces, your reinforcements, or by a piece capturing something that's already there. So in this matchup, shogi has the reinforcements to place or leave in hand in the deployment zone at the start of the game of 2 lances and 2 knights. So this is an example of a pretty okay, valid layout that you can do. And these additional pieces, while they can be captured from outside, otherwise these squares cannot be accessed. And that means that once everything leaves, this rank effectively does not exist. You also cannot do shogi drops here. And this is what we're utilizing in order to give the armies the material advantages they need. Okay. I could go through and tell you what the exact reinforcements and battlefield charge counts are for every army, but I don't feel like I need to do that. Instead, I'm going to cover the big changes that have come other than that. So, let's go back here. This is the important principles doc, which we have like really early in the rule book itself. It's just this set of sentences, which feel free to pause and read through it, but it basically outlines why these things exist in our game and why we're using it for this balance style. Okay, so I've briefly explained how setup and placement works in Titans Battalion. If you're brand new, I will cover it again. So first, the player going second picks what battlefield. So in this case, they picked 1 of 7, they picked T2. And the Shogi army then places first because they're the white player. Army pick is blind, is double blind, so neither player knows what the other got until they reveal it after battlefield choice. So battlefield gets chosen, armies double blind get picked as well, and then you attach to the side of the board. Now the Shogi army has an additional option to have an extra row here, so they could do this. If they want to, in order to have a little bit more shogi-like spacing, because the 2 across battlefields adversely affect the shogi army. Keep in mind, for the purposes of promotion, the shogi army always uses the enemy back 3 ranks, not including the ramparts. After both armies have placed, then the side that is weaker will place their reinforcements inside of the ramparts or leave them in the deployment zone off the board, where they can then be put onto the ramparts as a turn. So you are trading flexibility for tempo. Okay. And that's the entire setup, and then Sente goes, and then Gote goes. All right. I added some additional notes to explain how our stalemate rules work, but I don't feel like I need to talk about that since I have before. If you're curious, feel free to join the Discord and ask about it, or just click on the rulebook in the description and find it. I explained all that. I returned castling to be exactly like it is in chess, because as fun as it was, it is what it is. However, in party mode, you can still castle to your heart's content, just freaking everywhere. Golden Horde. Hasn't changed all that much since the last big update. Holy Empire. Okay, this is a big one. I have returned the soldiers to the Holy Empire army, so that they have their friends back. So they used to be, I'll just put the Holy Empire as black here. They used to look like this. Now they look like this. So they have their Zhanggi soldiers back, which can move and capture forward and sideways in the middle. Additionally, they have campmate back. So if either king gets to the enemy's back rank, not including ramparts, that player who did so wins. Because it turns out that the combination of this king's anti-facing rule, which makes it illegal for the kings to face each other orthogonally, this particular piece set, and that campmate rule makes some beautiful endgames that don't necessarily fully exist with just campmate alone or just any of the other stuff alone. And considering this army is a little lacking in beautiful endgames because everything has a non-capturing queen move just about, all of these bitches, it improves the game. And now, thanks to all of the lovely dials that we have, if this buff is too much, I can just give the enemy army a little bit of help. And thank fuck for that. Alright. Important note, since it's going to come up at some point, if an army, such as, say, the Shang-Chi army, has reinforcements, those reinforcements cannot reach squares of the enemy territory with their moves or attacks. So if the Shang-Chi army is given a cannon in hand, they could not be placed there or there. In the deployment zone. I keep calling it hand because that's what I'm used to. I believe that's mostly self-explanatory, though. Sorry, I wanted to get rid of the yellow on here to make sure I had that as orange. Brain no worky. What else? Spartans in Golden Horde did not actually need any battlefield charges, but we gave them to the armies for now anyway, in order to try to keep some balance consistent. If we just assume that those armies that were engine balanced against chess are the same strength as chess against all armies, at least by default. We will tweak things as balance needs later. Okay, let's go over Twin Suns. So for Twin Suns, I've actually removed the conflagrations from the army by default and included them as reinforcements. And the reason I did that was so that the Shang-Chi army doesn't need as much help against Twin Suns as they do against chess. And the more often we could put a small amount of pieces into the really weak armies like Shogi and Shang-Chi, the better. Now, Shogi is more resilient than Shang-Chi. It's not nearly as much of a glass cannon, but it still gets overwhelmed with time in its current form. The same type of thing happened to Frostbeast with the Seers. Another important note is the Twin Suns Embers. Here, let me just place a Twin Suns army real quick. The Twin Suns Embers do not require battlefield charges to use their battlefield movement, and that's because they were designed around having that battlefield movement, and removing it kind of breaks shit. I need to finish this up quick because I'm starting to get heartburn. Twin Suns is also the army that gives the enemy armies the most charges of battlefield charges of any of them, and that's purely because it's a 7-wide board and everything else is either 8 or 9. So a small board means enemy has more space for problems. Case in point. 1, 2, 3 in order to go forward and then over. 1, 2, 1. So the 8 wides, so chess gets 6 battlefield charges against Twin Suns specifically. Would you look at that? We're to Shang-Chi. Okay, Shang-Chi, it turns out that one of the core parts of Shang-Chi gameplay is the fact that there's these open files that allow infiltration and a lack of pawn structure. So letting the opponent have a pawn structure while you don't is not a good way to make it feel like Shang-Chi. So we're letting you just delete shit. You get to kill 2 pawns at the start of the game. Pick 2. It has a little bit of a different amount of not every army you get the salvo against. The opening salvo is basically flavored as in, oh, you're firing cannons to kill shit from the distance, as an opening barrage. It just depends. And you do have to be careful that you don't give your opponent open lines on the wrong things. So generally speaking, I recommend some combination of this pawn, and maybe this pawn is safe sometimes too. And I also somewhat recommend keeping things open in other ways. However, we're still going to have issues with the Shang-Chi army. It just feels like that this will make it easier on some things. More than likely, Shang-Chi is going to have to give enemy pieces loading of some sort, so that like the queen can't just come in and absolutely decimate shit for no reason, or like you give this rook loading and then you remove this pawn because you want this file open for some reason. and hey, your cannon's safe just long enough when the chess player is white for you to move the elephant in the way. That type of idea. So, but because we're able to balance individual matchups, things like opening salvo and making the enemy have loading can work. And they didn't before, because we were just trying to balance everything against medieval, and then we would find reasons that those ideas didn't work against other armies. And it was just frustrating. Anything else? Oh, lions can no longer go past this rank. Smiley face. And because that allows the enemy to infiltrate you a little bit more as well. Because, again, part of Shang-Chi game feel is the enemy being able to infiltrate and you being able to infiltrate them. And if you can't and they can't, then it doesn't feel like Shang-Chi. So we have to tone back the defense by 8 whole squares. Lions no longer have access to any of these squares that I just circled that they used to. However, they do technically have the ability, if you want to for some reason, you could target light squares with them instead, which might help against armies with fewer bishop attackers, and you feel like you have another way to deal with the bishop attackers, like you put one lion here, move this forward, and then you can move the lion there or something after the elephant goes, and the horse has this covered, and then you leave the other lion just to cover the light squares down this way for knight attacks, if you're worried about that, right? So it gives you a little bit more flexibility to answer other types of armies as well. Okay. Morning Calm basically just gets heavily affected by all of the big game changes. Shoguns, pieces in hand no longer can be dropped via shogi drop rules. They have to be dropped via reinforcements, which meant the reinforcement changes and they're heavily affected by the overall game rules. Frostbees, seers are now considered reinforcements. They only have seers against the heavy battalions, and they don't have it against anything else. Is that everything? Doesn't feel like everything. That was everything. Alright, enjoy. I'm putting this on main channel just because. How long is this? 27 minutes? Shit. If you want to ask me questions or talk to us in the Discord or take part in figuring out exactly what reinforcements all of these armies need against each other, links in the description. Be kind to each other. Peace out.